There was no lime-soaked curtain. The factory worker who lived beside the Thames in the summer of 1858 did not have a curtain to soak, did not have windows that could be meaningfully closed against what was outside them, did not have the option of retreating to a country estate or relocating the family to a house far enough from the river to escape what the river had become. The factory worker of Southwark and Bermondsey and Lambeth, the communities that crowded the south bank of the Thames in the years of the Great Stink, lived in the smell the way a fish lives in water, completely without exit, without the resources to negotiate a different relationship to the environment they inhabited. The parliamentary account of the Great Stink, the lime-soaked curtains, the members of parliament fleeing the committee rooms, Disraeli's speech about the Stygian pool, is the account of the people who made it into the historical record because they had the social position and the literacy and the proximity to power that writing history requires. The factory worker's account of the same summer does not exist in the same form because the factory worker of 1858 was not typically keeping a diary, was not writing letters to the press, was not making speeches in legislative chambers. The factory worker's experience of the Great Stink is recoverable only through the indirect evidence of housing conditions, the records of disease mortality, the reports of social investigators who entered working-class communities to document what they found there, and the rare first-person accounts that survived through exceptional circumstances. What those sources reveal is an experience of the Great Stink entirely different from the aristocratic experience. Not merely more severe in degree, but different in kind, shaped by the specific conditions of working-class life in mid-Victorian London that made the smell not an interruption of normal conditions, but the intensification of conditions that were already extreme. The factory workers' housing in the riverside communities of South London in 1858 was the product of 5 decades of unplanned industrial expansion that had converted agricultural land and market garden into an undifferentiated mass of industrial premises and residential streets, built to no design standard and maintained to no regulatory requirement. Housing a population that had grown faster than any infrastructure to support it could be constructed. A court in Bermondsey in the 1850s contained houses built on land that had been a tannery yard, that shared walls with a bone-boiling works, that were separated from the river by 50 meters of industrial premises whose waste discharged into the tributary streams that ran through the neighborhood before reaching the Thames. The house itself was typically a terrace property of 2 or 3 rooms, shared by a family whose size varied between 4 and 10 people, depending on how many children had survived infancy, sometimes shared with a lodger whose rent supplemented the household's income during periods of reduced work. The ground floor room served as kitchen, dining room, and sometimes workshop. The upper floor was the sleeping space, occupied by the adults and the children together. There was no indoor plumbing. The privy was in the yard, shared between multiple households, its contents accumulating in a cesspit beneath or beside it that was emptied at intervals that depended on the landlord's willingness to pay the night soil collectors. The water supply came from a standpipe in the street, shared by multiple households, fed by a water company whose intake pipes drew from the Thames at a point that, in theory, was upstream of the most concentrated sewage discharge and in practice was not far enough upstream to provide clean water. The Thames in 1858 was not merely unpleasant at its surface. It was contaminated throughout, the sewage that entered it at hundreds of points mixing with the water that the water companies drew for domestic supply and distributing waterborne pathogens through the supply network to every household that used the tap. The smell that the parliamentary accounts describe as overwhelming in the vicinity of the Palace of Westminster was, for the factory worker living beside the South Bank tributaries, a version of the smell that had been present in diminished form since the industrial development of the area began. The tanneries of Bermondsey, which processed hides using a combination of animal matter, oak bark, and urine-derived chemicals, produced a smell that was locally distinctive and consistently unpleasant. The bone-boiling works, which converted animal bones into fertilizer and the industrial chemicals that the Victorian economy required, produced a smell that neighbors described in the housing inspection reports of the 1840s and 50s in terms that the inspectors, who were not given an understatement, found adequate only in the most extreme language available. The hot summer of 1858 did not introduce the factory worker to an olfactory environment that they had not previously experienced. It took the existing environment and amplified it to a level that crossed the threshold from chronic tolerable burden into acute crisis. The specific chemical compounds responsible, the hydrogen sulfide, the ammonia, the volatile organic compounds of bacterial decomposition, were present throughout the year in the riverside communities of South London. In the summer of 1858, they were present at concentrations that produced not merely discomfort, but physical symptoms: nausea, headache, throat irritation, the specific burning sensation in the eyes and nose that high concentrations of hydrogen sulfide produce. The factory worker who reported to work at the tannery or the leather dressing works or the glue manufactory on the South Bank in the summer of 1858 was reporting to a workplace that added its own chemical contributions to an atmospheric environment already loaded with the Thames's exhalations. The tannery workers spent 12 hours per day in a building where the smell of the curing process was concentrated by the enclosed space and by the heat of the summer, where the pits of tanning liquor that the hides were processed and were actively fermenting in the 30-degree heat, where the combination of the industrial smell and the external smell from the river created an atmospheric compound that the factory inspection reports of the period described in terms that suggest the inspectors experienced physical difficulty in the buildings they were assessing. The hours of work that the factory worker performed in this environment were not reduced in acknowledgement of the atmospheric conditions. The factory owner had contracts to fulfill and wages to pay in a market that did not discount its requirements because the summer had made the riverside environment temporarily more hostile than usual. The factory worker continued at the 12-hour shift, 6 days per week, in the conditions that the summer of 1858 produced because the alternative to working was not working, and not working meant not eating, and the calculation between enduring the smell and feeding the family was a calculation that consistently resolved in the direction of endurance. The medical understanding of what the factory worker was experiencing was the same miasmatic theory that shaped the aristocrats' response. The belief that the smell was the disease, that breathing the corrupted air of the Thames's exhalations was the mechanism by which cholera and typhus and the other diseases of the riverside communities entered the body. This understanding was wrong in its mechanism, as we have already discussed, but it was right in its correlation. And for the factory worker living beside the Thames, the correlation was not a matter of abstract epidemiology, but of direct personal experience. The cholera that had swept through the South Bank communities in the epidemic years of the 1840s and the 1850s had killed the factory workers' neighbors, the factory workers' children, the factory workers' spouse. The geography of cholera mortality in Victorian London was not random. It followed the water supply, concentrating in the communities served by the water companies whose intakes drew from the most contaminated sections of the Thames, and the South Bank communities served by the Southwark and Vauxhall Water Company, whose intake was close enough to the main sewage discharges to be consistently contaminated, had mortality rates that exceeded those of other London communities in epidemic years by factors of 2 and 3. John Snow's famous mapping of the 1854 Broad Street cholera outbreak, which traced the deaths to a single contaminated water pump and demonstrated the waterborne transmission of cholera with an elegance that the medical establishment of the period was not quite ready to accept, was conducted in a community, Soho, that was somewhat removed from the South Bank. But the principle he demonstrated, that cholera followed the water rather than the air, was most visible in the differential mortality between communities served by different water companies, a differential that William Farr had been documenting statistically for years before Snow's pump handle removal provided the dramatic demonstration. The factory worker living in Bermondsey in 1858 was living in a community whose cholera mortality had been consistently higher than the London average for 20 years in the hot summer of 1858, which concentrated the Thames's contamination into a smaller volume of water and intensified the bacterial activity that produced both the smell and the waterborne pathogens, was a summer that many in the community recognized as the conditions that preceded epidemic. The recognition was not panic. It was the specific, weary vigilance of people who had learned from previous epidemics what the conditions that preceded them looked like, who had survived previous epidemics through the combination of luck and whatever protective practices the medical wisdom of the period recommended, and who understood that the summer of 1858 had a quality to it that warranted attention. The housewife who boiled the water before using it for cooking was not following a germ theory recommendation. Germ theory had not yet been established. She was following the accumulated practical wisdom of a community that had learned, through repeated, devastating experience, that water drawn from certain sources in certain conditions had consequences that boiling ameliorated. The boiling advice was correct for the wrong reason. It was recommended to drive off the miasmatic corruption of the water, not to kill the bacterial pathogens that the water contained. But it worked regardless of the mechanism attributed to it, and the households that could afford the fuel to boil their water consistently, and that had the knowledge that boiling helped, were households whose waterborne disease risk was reduced compared to households that did not boil. The factory workers' ability to afford the fuel to boil water consistently was not guaranteed. The cost of coal for a household fire was a real constraint for families living at the economic margins that the wages of unskilled and semi-skilled riverside factory work produced. The fuel used for cooking was the minimum necessary for the cooking, extended to boiling water only when the economic situation allowed or when the urgency of the disease risk was perceived as high enough to justify the expenditure. In the summer of 1858, with the Thames producing the most extreme atmospheric event in London's recent memory and the community's disease awareness consequently elevated, the boiling of water was probably more consistent than in ordinary summers. Whether consistently enough to affect the disease outcomes of the season is a calculation that the historical record does not permit to be made precisely. The experience of the great stink for the factory worker was also an experience of class in its most material form, because the smell was not equally distributed across London's social geography in the summer of 1858. The atmospheric dispersion of the Thames's exhalations was not uniform. It concentrated in the low-lying riverside communities where the factory worker lived and worked, where the streets were closest to the water, where the housing was densest and the ventilation poorest, where the tributary streams and the tidal inlets that the sewage discharge had converted into open drains contributed their own chemical contributions to the air. The West End neighborhoods where the wealthy lived were also affected by the Great Stink. The parliamentary accounts make clear that the smell was pervasive enough to reach Mayfair and Belgravia, but the effect was the effect of an environmental intrusion into an otherwise adequate living environment. The windows could be closed. The pomanders could be employed. The house was large enough that the contaminated air admitted through one side could be partially offset by better air admitted through the other. The country estate was available as a refuge. For the factory worker in Bermondsey, the smell was not an intrusion into an otherwise adequate environment. It was the intensification of an already inadequate environment, added to the smell of the tannery and the glue works and the bone boilers and the slaughterhouse and the drainage ditch beside the backcourt, producing an atmospheric compound that occupied every waking moment and every sleeping moment because the windows could not be closed. The summer heat made the rooms uninhabitable with the windows shut, and the house had no other side from which better air could be admitted. The Great Stink ended in the autumn of 1858. The parliamentary legislation authorizing Bazalgette's sewers passed, and the construction began in 1859, and the metropolitan sewerage system that the construction produced was, over the following decade, one of the most significant improvements in public health that Victorian London experienced. The cholera mortality rates in the riverside communities fell dramatically after the sewers diverted the sewage from the drinking water supply. The atmospheric environment of the South Bank improved as the open sewers and the tidal inlets were covered and connected to the intercepting system. The factory worker of Bermondsey who survived the Great Stink did not see the cholera return in the epidemic form of the 1840s and 50s. The last major cholera epidemic in London was the Whitechapel outbreak of 1866, and its containment was achieved partly through the application of the waterborne transmission understanding that Snow's work had established and that the medical establishment had, by the 1860s, largely accepted. The lives saved by the sewers were overwhelmingly the lives of people like the factory worker of the Great Stink Summer. The people who lived closest to the contamination, who had the least ability to escape it, whose disease mortality was highest, and whose political voice in the decision to build the infrastructure that saved them was the least of any group affected by the problem it was built to address. The parliamentary legislation was passed by the men who could not open their windows. The lives saved were the lives of the people who could not close theirs. The distribution of benefit and the distribution of political agency in the Great Stinks Resolution were not the same distribution, and the difference between them is one of the more instructive aspects of the episode for anyone trying to understand how large public health decisions are actually made. The factory worker continued to work through the summer of 1858, 12 hours per day, 6 days per week, in the conditions the summer produced. The lime-soaked curtains were not available. The country house was not available. The ability to reframe the experience as a temporary inconvenience rather than a chronic condition of life was not available. What was available was the evening return to the court, the shared standpipe, the children at the door, the small fire in the ground floor room. The specific resilience of people who have no alternative to endurance and who have organized their lives accordingly. The smell was there when they arrived, and there when they slept, and there when they woke, and there when they left for work again in the morning. They went to work again in the morning. That is the whole of the factory workers' account of the Great Stink. And it is the account that the lime-soaked curtains were hung to obscure,